Welcome to the Got Questions podcast. We're going to be tackling a question or maybe an accusation that's often thrown at Christians today. So joining me to answer this question, which I'll reveal here in a second, is Jeff, who's the managing editor of BibleRef.com,
Hello.
and Kevin, the editor-in-chief of Got Questions Ministries. So the question / accusation today is, why are all Christians hypocrites? Hopefully, we'd prefer the question to be asked is, are all Christians hypocrites? But the way it's typically asked is just assuming that we are. And the interesting part of the question is it comes down to how you define the term. There's obviously no Christian in this world is perfect. We all still sin. We all still make mistakes. We all still fail to live up to the standard that we preach. But does that make us hypocrites? By saying, I believe Christians should live this way, and then occasionally failing, is that actually hypocrisy? Or is that just failing to live up to a standard that we think is the right standard? And if that's the standard, then everyone on this entire planet is a hypocrite, because no one perfectly holds up to any standard that they set. So let's keep that in mind as we go through this. But Jeff, tell me a little bit more. What is the actual definition of a hypocrite, biblically speaking, culturally speaking, and why is this not a fair accusation to make?
Yeah, I think you're right that there's a difference between asking why are all Christians hypocrites versus are all Christians hypocrites versus asking what is a hypocrite, because it depends on the definition. And in the Bible, the word hypocrite comes from a term that literally refers to an actor. It's a person who is pretending to be something that they actually are not. So from a biblical standpoint, in order for something to be true hypocrisy, you have to have a person who believes one thing, but the way they behave, the way they act, they are making a choice, or they are fooling themselves or convincing themselves to behave or act or do or speak in a way that's contrary to the thing that they say they believe. And there's a difference between that, like you said, between a person who believes something but struggles to actually maintain it. So examples of true hypocrisy would be somebody who says, for example, it's very important to be honest. You need to be honest. You should not lie. And then we find out that that person is routinely, constantly making up truths and falsehoods and rumors and things like that. That's a true hypocrite. That's somebody who is claiming that they are honest, but who is actually doing something different. Or a person who says that morality is very important and you need to be a faithful person in your relationships and your marriage. And we find out that that person's been cheating routinely on their spouse. That's a true hypocrite in that sense. Now, that's different from a person who says something like, I think that we need to be honest. We need to tell the truth. And then you find out that that person has told a lie, either recently or at some point in their life. And the person says, you're right, I should not have done that. And even when I did it, I knew it was not what I was supposed to do. If that's not a pattern for that person, then that's human nature. That's a failure. That's not hypocrisy in the biblical sense. But that second sense is the way the world usually uses hypocrisy. We usually call somebody a hypocrite anytime we can find them failing to live up to some standard that they said that they've put forward. And as you were saying, Shay, in that sense, now the different questions start to make sense. So if we use the worldly definition or the modern definition of hypocrite, now we can ask, why are all Christians hypocrites? And the answer is because all human beings are hypocrites in that definition. Nobody ever fully lives up to their moral standards perfectly. We're all going to fall short. The only way you can never fall short of moral standards that you have is to not have any. If your standards are, I do what I want, when I want, for whatever reason I want, then you'll pretty well live up to that whenever. But normal people, regular people, sometimes we're going to fall short. And the Christian gospel, the message of the Bible, accepts that and understands that. There are places in Scripture where you see people like Paul saying, I want to do this, but I'm drawn to do that. What am I supposed to do? How do I handle this? We have John telling us, if you claim that you don't have sin, you're a liar and you're fooling yourself. So Christians don't believe that a person is a spiritual, true hypocrite just because they sometimes have done something that contradicts things that they believe, even people who routinely contradict things that they believe, is still not necessarily a spiritual hypocrite. When it says that Jesus was a friend of sinners, a lot of the people that he was with understood that some of the things that they were involved with were not moral, that they were struggling with things that were habits and addictions and problems, but they were willing to say, I admit that those things are not right, and those are things that I know I should not do and I need to avoid. The people that Jesus called hypocrites, the biblical hypocrites, were the people who pretended, the ones who were saying, I strongly say this particular moral thing, but I'm going to live in a way that is not compatible with that, and I'm going to be very blatant and very overt about it. So when people see Christians and they say, well, sometimes the things that you say don't match what you believe, you're right. And that's something that we don't want to brush off as believers and say, what's the difference? Everybody's like that. But it's fair for us to say that you're right. We do sometimes fail to live up to the standards that we claim. And when we recognize it and we know that and we strive to not do that, that's not biblical hypocrisy. That's just being a sinner in need of a savior.
I appreciate the fact that you're making a distinction there, Jeff, between the biblical definition of hypocrisy and what we see today, which is sometimes called hypocrisy, which is more just, occasional failings. And we all struggle with these type of things. Every human being does. If someone says to me, why are all Christians hypocrites? And I can actually, have a conversation with this person, there would be some questions that I'd want to ask. And the first one would be, is everyone in the church a Christian? Why is everybody in the church a hypocrite? Well, is everybody in the church actually a Christian? Because just being associated with a church, just attending a church regularly, does not make one a born-again child of God. It does not mean that person is a Christian. You can't judge a whole group of people by the actions of somebody who may not even be part of that group in reality. So we've got to be careful right up front with that. Another question I would ask is every Christian in the church a hypocrite, or only some? There may be some hypocrites in the church. We've been guilty of hypocrisy, probably all of us at one point or another at some time in our lives. But are we talking about the whole church? Are we talking about maybe just a handful of Christians who are actually living in hypocrisy? And again, you can't judge a whole group of people by the actions of a few. And I think when you look back through history, you're going to see that in the main, Christians have been a very sincere group of people, a very committed group of people who have made a positive impact in society, a positive influence in the world, living by the golden rule. I mean, this is the standard that most Christians have upheld throughout all of church history. Third question would be, does Christianity in general condone hypocrisy or condemn it? And of course, the answer is that Christianity condemns hypocrisy in no uncertain terms. The New Testament contains many examples of hypocrisy, and it's condemned in every instance. Jesus called out those who made a pretense of righteousness, whether they were giving alms or they were fasting or praying, drawing attention to themselves in each of these activities. Jesus said that's hypocritical. You should not be doing these things to be seen by men. You're doing these things to serve the Lord, and because you have a heart to truly love God. And so Jesus very clearly and several times called out the hypocrites of his day. And Christians readily admit to being sinners. In fact, I think that's one of the requirements to be a Christian. You have to admit that you're a sinner. But we don't. But being a sinner does not equate to being a hypocrite. The word sinner and the word hypocrite are not synonymous, and it's possible to be a sinner without being a hypocrite. Hypocrisy is a sin, but there are other sins besides the sin of hypocrisy. Another question I would ask is, how many sins must a Christian commit before he's considered a hypocrite? If the answer is, well, just one, then everybody's a hypocrite. Everybody, because everybody has sinned at some point, and everybody fails. So that's not a fair evaluation to say, hey, you sin one time, you mess up one time, that makes you a hypocrite. That's demanding absolute perfection, which is unreasonable. You also need to ask, was Jesus a hypocrite? And I found this from Josh McDowell and Don Stewart from one of their publications, and I thought this was excellent. Say this, quote, Christianity does not stand or fall on the way Christians have acted throughout history or are acting today. Christianity stands or falls on the person of Jesus, and Jesus was not a hypocrite. He lived consistently with what he taught, and at the end of his life, he challenged those who had lived with him night and day over 3 years to point out any hypocrisy in him. His disciples were silent because there was none. Since Christianity depends on Jesus, it is incorrect to try to invalidate the Christian faith by pointing to horrible things done in the name of Christianity. End of quote. And then the last question that I would ask a person who says, why are all church people hypocrites, is this: is it possible that Christians are a work in progress? See, more important than the fact that some Christians might be actually hypocritical is the issue of how a Christian handles the sin. Is he willing to confess it? Is he willing to forsake it? Is he trying to overcome it? And so to the critic, I would say, can you see into the heart of a person who has failed? And do you know that whether or not this person is truly repentant, truly sorrowful and remorseful for his actions, and what's his attitude towards sin? And I think we need to give people the benefit of the doubt. The church is filled with sinners. We readily admit that, because church is the place we go to find redemption from sin. But again, the word sin and the word hypocrisy are not interchangeable. They are not synonymous.
Yeah, I love the distinction we're trying to make here. I think it's so incredibly important. Whenever I think of the term hypocrite, specifically in the Bible, my mind goes to Matthew chapter 7, verses 3-5, which reads, Jesus asked, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. And to me, there's another one I go to when someone asks, well, did Jesus have a sense of humor? To me, like, this story is so crazy. I picture Jesus having a smile on his face while he's telling it, and maybe someone kind of laughing at the ridiculous of the story, at the idea of someone having basically a log attached to their forehead while they're focusing so much on a tiny speck of sawdust in someone else's eye. And that's what Jesus is describing hypocrisy as, is attacking someone else or pointing out a flaw in someone else or a sin in someone else when you struggle with that thing multiplied by 1,000. Like claiming, I've overcome this sin, I'm victorious over it, let me help you, when you're actually struggling with it worse than that person is. It's the untruthfulness, the representing yourself as something that you're not, or claiming you have victory over something when you don't. That's what Jesus is pointing in this passage, and that ultimately is what I think we need to focus on. A Christian sinning is a problem. It is something that has to be confessed, repented from, and overcome. That is not what makes someone a hypocrite. A hypocrite is claiming you are something you're not, claiming that you are sinless or overcome certain sins when you have not, claiming that going after people who commit a certain sin when you're secretly doing the same thing yourself. That's the biblical understanding of hypocrisy. It's not just a Christian making a mistake. I mean, in the Bible, Jesus told the woman in John 8, go and sin no more. In 1 Peter, it says, be holy as I am holy. Well, if sinlessness is the standard between of what hypocrisy is, then yes, all Christians are hypocrites. But that's not what the Bible is talking about. Making mistakes, sinning, failing to live up to God's holy standard is not hypocrisy unless you are someone who's claiming you have overcome those things, unless you're representing yourself as something that you're not. If a Christian is saying, I'm fallen, I make mistakes, I'm not sinless, I struggle in these areas, if that's the attitude, well, then yes, committing a sin is still wrong. It's still an offense to God, but it's not hypocrisy.
I think it's good for us to remember there's a difference between the toggle switch of on and off and the concept of degree. So in the biblical sense, there's a little bit more of a toggle, like you're either a hypocrite or you're not. So hypocrisy is a pretender, it's faker. So if you kind of read through these passages where Jesus is talking to people and calling them hypocrites, if you replace a word like you faker or you fraud, you kind of get a little bit more of the sense of what's being said there. But even in the modern sense, we got to remember that there's a little bit of a question of degree. Everybody represents themselves as better than we really are. That's just a fact. I mean, every single person we put on a self to the world that is better than who we really are. There's lots of things we think and want and desire and do that we don't tell other people, that we don't admit to, that we don't do whatever. So there's a difference between us sometimes falling short, and it's not necessarily that we just suddenly cross a barrier and we get there. There's going to be a point of us there's a judgment call of whether we're going to consider that person a hypocrite. I like to think of myself as a kind person. Some people are chuckling when they hear that. I know who you are. That's not funny. I consider myself a kind person, but I know that there's been times in my life, moments where even in the recent past, I have said or done or thought things that were not kind. Most people wouldn't consider that to be hypocritical. If they look and they say, yeah, generally Jeff is, he does all right with that, then they wouldn't say I'm a hypocrite when I say something about being a kind person. But the more that difference, the more unkindness becomes a pattern, the more it becomes the norm, the more we obviously look at a person and say, yeah, now you're getting into real hypocrisy. Now you really are pretending to be something that you're not. And the biggest danger I think that we get into with this is that, first of all, that we don't understand that there's a little bit of a degree, a gradient to this thing. But I think we also sometimes confuse hypocrisy with truth. Which is where typically a lot of people want to use that accusation against Christians. A lot of times when people say all Christians are hypocrites, they're saying it in a dismissive way because what they're trying to say is Christianity is false or the Bible is not true because, well, all Christians are hypocrites. And I bring up the idea that hypocrisy and martyrdom are the two extremes around a central balance point, and that point is sincerity. When a person is a martyr, when a person is willing to die for something, that is proof that that person is sincere. It is absolute proof that that person truly and really believes this thing that they are doing. A hypocrite is a pretender. That's a person who is sort of proving that they don't really believe this the way that they say they are. But here's the thing, just because you're a martyr does not necessarily mean that what you're dying for is true or is correct. If I think throwing myself in a volcano is going to stop it from erupting, that's pretty sincere, but it's pretty wrong. So my sincerity is not a test of truth. People have to remember that hypocrisy works the same way. Just because somebody is hypocritical about something does not somehow mean that the thing that they are claiming is therefore false. So people can say things like, Christ does not want us to be this way or to do this thing or to have these thoughts or to perform these actions. People who say that but do those actions anyway only prove that they are living inconsistently with the faith that they claim. They are not actually proving that that faith is incorrect. It could be that when somebody is a martyr for something, it's because it really is true. It can be that when somebody is a hypocrite about something, it's because that thing is not actually real. But strictly speaking, all we know from a hypocrite is that they don't really believe the thing that they're saying. Maybe that gives us reasons to think it's true or not true, but we don't want to jump to the conclusion of saying, oh, well, when I see hypocrisy in somebody, that's proof that what that person is saying is not actually right, because that's not what it means.
D. James Kennedy. I did a lot of teaching on evangelism and soul winning, and he would run into this question quite often. And people saying to him, "Well, I'm not going to try church. All those church people are hypocrites." And he had a stock answer that he would come back with when he would face that type of accusation, and he would say, "All the church is full of hypocrites. Well, there's always room for one more." And I think the point he was making was just, it's everybody has their foibles. Everybody has got problems, and we can't lift ourselves up as having none. I thought of another question that I think I probably would ask somebody who confronted me with this type of an accusation of all church people are hypocrites. And I probably should have actually start with a question like this, but I should probably ask, do you see any hypocrisy in my life? If there's something there that I'm blind to, I would appreciate knowing so that I can work on it. And I would try to ask that sincerely and to really mean it. Maybe there are some areas in my life that I need to be more careful of, that I am putting forward a false pretense. And maybe this person sees it and can help me to identify it so that I can confess it and forsake it. So I think having these types of conversations and an attitude of humility is probably a good tact as well.
And that's a great point, Kevin. And I love how you've been breaking it down with different questions you would ask someone. With so many, definitely not all, but a lot of attacks against the Christian faith, like the all Christians are hypocrites one, are due to someone having a negative experience with someone who is a Christian or claimed to be a Christian or with the church at some point in their past. They experienced what in their mind was some degree of hypocrisy by someone claiming to be a Christian, and then that leads them down this road of, well, all Christians are hypocrites. So even asking that question was, what has led you to this conclusion that all Christians are hypocrites? And what do you mean by hypocrite? And then maybe going through the different principles we've talked about today of, here's actually what a hypocrite is. Christians not being perfect does not make them hypocrites. Helping to understand, helping one, you to understand where they're coming from, why they think this way, and two, helping them understand that no, Christians aren't perfect. That doesn't make them hypocrites. I think those are two very key distinctions we can make when we come across someone making this accusation. It's
important to, I think, we probably need to emphasize a little bit more also that idea of, is the person who's being accused a Christian? And we don't want to be arrogant about that and just dismiss that and say that, well, is this person actually a believer? As we've said, believers are capable of saying and doing things that are inconsistent with their beliefs. But it at least is fair, because using the label Christian is different from saying, I believe the things that Christ taught and the things that Christ actually said. Sometimes we'll find that when a person uses the label Christian and then you ask them about the things they believe about certain issues, you find that they have opinions that are contrary to Christ. In a weird way, that's not even hypocrisy, because they're not even really claiming to be a believer, but then again, they are. But you see the idea that sometimes we need to be a little more nuanced with somebody who does a thing we don't like, and we say, oh, he's a Christian and he does this thing, so he's a hypocrite. I think we also have to remember that sometimes making an accusation of hypocrisy against somebody is a tacit admission that you agree with the principle. In other words, when somebody is accused of being a hypocrite because they're being dishonest, what the person is saying is, I agree that we should be honest, and I don't like the fact that this person is dishonest. And sometimes it's not the case. Sometimes when you accuse somebody of hypocrisy, you're not really agreeing with them. You're just noting the inconsistency. But even then, when you note the inconsistency, you can't really then blame the philosophy or the faith or the teaching for what that person is doing. So here again, this idea of truth is, when you notice that somebody is being hypocritical, the worst you can say is, that person does not seem to believe or to do this thing. So when people do things that are blatantly contrary to something the faith teaches, we can make accusations of hypocrisy. What we can't do is we can't turn around and say, oh, Christians say they're all about love, but then they've done this thing in history that was violent, or they've done this thing in history that was intolerant. Well, what you're really saying is the problem is that Christians don't live up to Christ the way they should. The solution to that is not less Christianity. The solution to that is more, and people being more consistent and more faithful with it. So here we can see how even in understanding hypocrisy, it still all comes down to what is true and what is false. How sincere is somebody and how are they not? And even if we're going to criticize it, what we're really doing is saying, you're right, God is God and we're not, and we need to be consistent and faithful in the way we handle these things.
So, wow, Jeff, that's I wasn't expecting to be so convicted by recording this episode, but ultimately our standard is Christ, and we all fail to live up to that standard.
We do. I do.
So we need to be careful about humility in the sense of not presenting ourselves differently than what we actually are. It's one thing for someone to admit, look, I'm fallen, I struggle, I experienced Romans 7 just like Paul did. I see the good things I want to do, and yet I end up doing the bad things I don't want to do. I'm struggling with this. I'm a work in progress. My standard is Christ, and I'm forever going to fail to perfectly live up to that standard. Having that attitude will prevent people from viewing you as a hypocrite, just understanding you're a human being who is striving for an ideal that ultimately in this life is impossible to achieve, versus presenting yourself with the holier than thou attitude, the stereotypical Christian that much of the world hates, the person who claims to be righteous but is not, the person who preaches but doesn't practice what he preaches. Let's be the first type and not the second. And then when this accusation is thrown at Christians, let's make sure we explain to people, like, one, what a hypocrite actually is. Failing to live up to a perfect standard does not make one a hypocrite. And then two, pointing people to, like you said, Jeff, the ideal. If I could point to one person in the history of the world who was not a hypocrite, it was Jesus Christ. Christianity does not stand or fall on the behavior of Christians. It stands or falls on the person and work of Jesus Christ. So I think that's the great corrective for both our attitudes towards hypocrisy in ourselves and others, and also how to answer this particular accusation. So thank you for this conversation. And it's a question we get fairly often. It's a very common attack used against Christians. And I hope you hear us today explaining why we think it's inaccurate, why it's misplaced, and also how to respond to the question of why are all Christians hypocrites? Hope this conversation today has been helpful for you. Sure was helpful for me today. Got questions? The Bible has answers, and we'll help you find them.